1 Corinthians chapter 1, we are picking up in verse 13, which is a little bit awkward. To understand where we are in the flow, he has been introducing the themes which he is going to be developing throughout his entire work here. He is talking about the name of Christ. That's a theme that we've already seen. He introduced that even in the salutation. He came back to it in the prayer. And he is all building around these problems they had that he is going to address as he moves through the body of the book. And so what we found when we moved into verse 10 is that there is a significant problem, and he is going to address it, that he's received an account from those of the household of Chloe, that there are some problems there. It probably coincided with also a report and asking questions about what they wondered about, things they wanted to know. They're still a young congregation, and you see that in both the problems and the questions. Well, he's going to address both of those. The two problems fall within the first 6 chapters of the book, and then the questions mainly through the remaining chapters of the book. So the first thing we find in verse 10 is the problem of division that he addressed, and then he illustrated that by what followed in verses 11 through 13, in which he is explaining then, "For it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you. Now I say this, that each of you says, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul?" Now notice what he has done in connecting some of these things is the problem is division. We addressed that in principle as well in verse 10, how he has pointed out the nature of the problem, the solution, and then the means to be able to fix the problem in the latter portion of that verse. But here, the direct problem, we discussed this last week, has to do with making your attachment to men. And that understanding of, not that any of these men would have done this. This is an important point to understand this text. Paul was not promoting himself. He's about to make that very clear. He does so in verse 13. Peter was not promoting himself. Apollos was not promoting himself. Christ was the center of the gospel. And yet it did not matter that the people there brought in and had such a strong attachment to the people, likely who taught them, that they followed on their practice from former religion of that it was acceptable to have these multiple kind of attachments and to have pick your preference. And we see that in our own way in the world today too. He said, that's not right. I don't want you attached to me. Peter does not want you attached to him. Apollos does not want you following him. And so as he comes down to this, in verse 13, he is stating some rhetorical questions to make this point. Is Christ divided? Now, I want you to walk back to verse 10 quickly now to understand and appreciate fully what he is doing here. Because as he goes back in verse 10, he says, "Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment." The word here for Christ divided, is the idea of portioned out. And it's the whole idea of, well, there was Paul, there was Christ, and then he looked around in the different apostles, and he gave them a church. He gave them a group of a following, and he gave this person a following. He gave Apollos a following. And he is just throwing around the different followers. That's exactly the problem he's addressing. It says was wrong. That's not what Christ did. And of course, that actually is what is broadly accepted in the world today as being what Christ did. Not at all. He opposed that. The idea of being portioned out is opposed to unity, and therefore he says, is Christ divided? The answer is absolutely not. Christ, you don't portion out like that, like he is some kind of, here, you take a leg and you take an arm. He is one Savior, and he does things one way. He then follows that with something he's going to also build on. Paul wasn't crucified on your behalf, was he? Now, I'm giving my own translation on that. Because he's emphasizing, no. Now, clearly, Paul is writing this. He's not dead. And that's the point. But think about what he's really saying here. You see, we understand these words, and we think that means we've thought about it. What is he really getting to? Who should you be completely attached to? Christ. Why? Because he's the one who can save you, and he showed he could save you because he went to the cross for you. He had to have the character to make that have any meaning. He had to have a perfect life of holiness. He had to be doing it as God's will, and he had to simply accept it rather than produce it, deliberately walk in front of a moving vehicle or something. It was something done to him. And yet he accepted it. He was crucified, but this part matters, on your behalf, which is a preposition that means he stepped in front of you or covered you up to take the harshness of the blows, to take what was heading your direction. He was, not that we were going to be crucified, but death. He did something that you could not have done. And as Paul's saying, and that I could not have done. There's not a single preacher who has been in this pulpit who is in any way qualified to die on your behalf. So what Paul is saying is, don't act like it. That the attachment needed is not to the preacher, and as long as he's okay, I'm okay. But rather, eliminate the preacher except for his role. He's going to cover that in chapter 3. You need to be attached to Jesus Christ. He's the one you belong to. He's the one that died for you. He's the one that saves you. And if you get into the personalities of the people, it leads to division. And anyone who is a gospel preacher, truly preaching the gospel, is not going to want you following them. Because this is a servant role in serving Christ, which is what Paul's emphasis has been. Now we look at the last question, which he's going to build on now and be what we will cover mainly today. He asks the question, or were you immersed into Paul's name? Were you baptized into the name of Paul? Now, he's building something up that's important. He already said, is Christ a portion? The answer is rhetorically, no. Was Paul crucified on your behalf? If you didn't understand, the answer is no. And of course, that's done to make sure we understand that the rhetorical question he's answering now, were you baptized into the name of Paul? The correct answer is no. So let's consider then, what does that mean, into the name of? The authority is part of it. Because we would think, the reason why I say that is, Paul was talking about, like in Acts chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, those ideas are paralleled. Where you have, by what power or by what name, right? By what authority, by what name are you doing these things? But here it's into, which is the idea of you're reaching the idea of relationship. It's hard because in the original, these particular prepositions, ace and in, speak of relationship often, and it's hard to communicate that in the English. The whole idea of entering in whose relationship are you entering? Why? Now tie it together with what he just said. Of Christ. What makes you of Christ? Being baptized into his name. Matthew chapter 28. Jesus gives the Great Commission. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them into the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. Same idea here, into the name. Okay? In association, again, with baptism. You're entering relationship. And he is making sure you understand that it is not simply a matter then of what is stated at the time of baptism. It is something that needs to have been understood at the time of baptism. Kevin?
What is the difference here with ice versus unto and into? Because, I've read there on Galatians 3:26-27, into where he says, ice there by following the verb baptism is into. When you used Matthew 28 and you said into the name.
Yeah, it's not always translated that way.
Yeah. But the word baptism is still an active.
Yes. Yeah. That's why I gave it that way. Okay. Now, to understand the question that Kevin's asking about the nature of the word, I'm going to give it ace just because the guys know that I'm going to pronounce things my way no matter what. But those Germans don't trust their pronunciation. So you should know this. Okay, I know. That's why you should know not to trust the Germans. Okay, sorry, too subtle. So the whole idea of this word ace, which preposition, of it indicates the end in mind. Okay, now there are a couple of objections to that, but I'll show you that in a moment. It points to the end in mind. The action is carried by the verb. Now, this is why, thank you for this tangent. This is why it sometimes has the word that means translated believe, okay, pisteuo, and it'll have pisteuo ace. But it doesn't mean into or onto that word. You can believe, it'll have ace, Christ. But you can't believe into Christ because there's not the motion and believe. It is intransitive. So you have the idea what is there is, it is you believe on Christ. Not translated consistently in your New Testaments very well to make that distinction. But the whole idea of when that happens is, the point is, you believe, the end of the belief is fully on Christ. Well, the motion of baptism is showing you like you would come into a place. It is because it is the idea of I come and go that takes you there. It's just saying, here's where you're going. And that's what this idea of baptism does, is it's going all the way, and in this case, into that relationship. Now, again, there's the main objection I've heard to that is in Matthew chapter 12, where, I think this will illustrate the word, then I'll leave it. In Matthew chapter 12, people are objecting to Jesus, accusing him of all kinds of things. And he says that the people repented at the preaching of Jonah. The word at there is ace. And so they'll say, well, no, wait a minute. Clearly in that passage, then, they didn't repent into the preaching of Jonah. So it means they preached because of the preaching of Jonah, clearly from that passage. No, that's not what it means. That's an example of wish casting. What you want it to mean into the passage and therefore missing the point. The meaning of that word doesn't change. It means that the people of Nineveh repented unto the point required by Jonah's preaching. And therefore the Bible is consistent in the usage of the words. And if we'll be consistent with the usage of the words, we'll be consistent in how we interpret the Bible too. So anyway, so that's why I'm trying to go back and show you that consistent use of this. It indeed is used in the same way as in Matthew chapter 28, though it's not translated that way, and in a shortened form of Galatians 3:27, that you're baptized into Christ. That isn't just a metaphysical kind of realm, it's relationship. Okay? And remember that the context here of what he's doing, he's dealing with men. Paul, you didn't at that time, when I baptized you, enter a relationship with me. You do because we would both be Christians, but that's not the point. The baptism is to get you into a relationship with Jesus Christ, because that's what saves you, because he died for you. And that's what they were losing sight of. They were attaching significance to the person doing the baptizing over the one who died on the cross for them, which is why he brings that up. Now, this demonstrates why this whole issue is how we have to think of it today. Why would you fall for something like that? Because it's close to you. You can see that person, and therefore the attachment is easier, it's more straightforward. It is closer to what we see in other realms of life. They had never met Jesus. And so that kind of, we can have that same problem. We actually have a lot more in common with them in this, in that we can attach ourselves, that person who taught me and baptized me, that person will hold a special place in your heart forever, I would hope. But it's not Jesus. And so he's wanting to make sure you understand that they understand that, of what he's wanting to accomplish, is that the relationship that's established that matters is not the person who gives you a big hug right afterwards, which I like to do when I baptize someone and just get even wet too. Right? That relationship. The more important relationship is what you gain with Jesus, because Jesus in that relationship is what makes forgiveness possible, what makes hope possible, which makes heaven possible, which makes understanding he's the one who provides all this and that ties you to God. That's the mediation. That's his role of being a high priest, to represent us to God. So notice how he builds on this and the problems that had come up. And it's important we get this in context because of how this passage is abused, particularly verse 17. So let's continue. People take 14 and all of a sudden we end up having all sorts of fun with context. I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. Now if we just stopped right there, then we'd have a really great argument against baptism, wouldn't we? But that's not what he's saying. Okay? This is one of those things where it's unfortunate when they divide up the verses this way. Lest anyone should say that I baptized in my own name. Now that part's important. He did not want people to think that I baptized into, same wording, into my own name, to get my own followers. Now, let's give some more background on this to appreciate the problem. Corinth is in Achaia, which is southern Greece, and therefore it had close proximity to Athens, even though it was more of a commercial city. But the nature of that was not just paganism, but also philosophy. And because of that, they were familiar with having traveling teachers. You see this actually alluded to by Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 through 12, though it's never mentioned directly that was a practice. And so Paul deliberately is avoiding that idea of a person who had come through town, tell you, I'll teach you stuff, but you got to pay up. That was one of the things they did. That's how they made their money. You know, I'll give you knowledge, entertain you for a while. You pay me money. That's why Paul wouldn't accept money in Thessalonica, because of that problem. But it also, they were building their own following. Remember also that this has Jewish roots too, if you go back to the rabbinical schools. There's a reason why there was more than one rabbinical school. Because each rabbi was essentially gaining his own followers. Now, there ended up being schools, two main schools. But again, think about that. If you were Jewish in Corinth, it would still make sense that, well, I'm of the school of Paul. I'm in the school of Peter. You go different directions. If you will read in certain commentaries today that think of themselves as scholarly, they will talk about the Pauline approach versus the Johannine approach. So you can have, you see that to them, Paul and John are not actually talking about exactly the same thing. They've got different ideas about Christianity. And therefore they don't see that it's two ways of talking about the same thing and addressing particular problems. They will argue it essentially as apostles divided up and having their own little way of doing Christianity. Now, that's very convenient in the modern world. That was not what was actually happening, though. Now, this, I remind you, is what happens and what you see in scholarly literature. This is what Paul's trying to prevent here. Okay? I'm not here for personal followers. Now, let me show you a problem where this can. We're going to come up to the modern day now, everybody. Are y'all ready for this? Okay. I'm going to quote, this is not me. As I'm giving my report on my mission work, we were overseas and I baptized 50 people in this particular province. And we have to report on, I was over here and we had 25 people come forward. You see, actually, sometimes we will play into this same thing of making it about conquests that are individual more than the gospel reaching a heart and what is established there. Because we respond to it. We respond to numbers. We respond to the big, the power, whatever it sounds like. Wow, I wish that were going on here. We respond to it. It has a lot of things in common here. Not because the men themselves are doing something wrong in their preaching, but because of it tends to move the focus in what you do in a presentation. Notice what he says. He says he did baptize Crispus and Gaius. Now notice this. If Paul didn't believe in baptism, why was he baptizing Crispus and Gaius? I mean, why single them out for baptism? Is it just because they made it there for Baptism Sunday? The way some people treat it. No, these were early converts. And he did actually, and this is the distinction we're going to see, perform the baptism itself. Lest anyone should say that I baptized in my name. I do not want people thinking that in baptizing people, that's going to be something that's going to be their call to fame one day, is that so-and-so baptized me. I like the person who taught the person on the Bible study to do the baptizing myself. And I like fathers to baptize their children when they come to age and want to obey the gospel. So I'm going to say something right now. I have no idea how many people I've actually baptized. I don't keep track. Because that's not the point. And that's what I'm trying to get across here about what he's doing. He then follows this up in verse 16 and says, yes, I also baptized the household of Stephanas. That's true. There's some kind of distinction he's making here between Crispus and Gaius and the household of Stephanas. It's not clear what that distinction is, but he wants to include them. It could just be rhetorical language, or that, okay, at a different time in a situation, yes, they are here, and maybe he'd baptize them in another place, but yes, I did baptize them. Yes? Mm-hmm. The numbers? Yeah. You have 3,000 and then 5,000 later on, and after that it says many. So it's giving you a sense of proportion early on to a big shift to understand how many people were in Jerusalem. And we sometimes forget how many people were in Jerusalem that should have obeyed the gospel that day. And that 3,000 is actually a very small number, percentage-wise. But it is giving you that idea of what their core was. The number itself doesn't matter to me. It's that we focus on that because it was just as important when Lydia was baptized as it was when the 3,000. And that when you move forward on, you're going to see something, and it's the idea of the beginning of the church versus what it takes to sustain that and build upon that. The reason why I emphasize the latter is because that's where we are. If you look in the Restoration literature, you will see similar things about as they were building the number of people that were wanting to do the right thing. But once established, it's going to naturally be less because your pool, in a sense, goes down of people who are interested. So it's not a matter of the number itself being mentioned. That's not my objective. It's a matter of making sure that we are getting the emphasis and priority right. So that our emphasis, no matter how many people, is going to be on people's hearts. I mean, I've been overseas, and I've had baptisms when I was overseas. Not lots, because that wasn't why I went there, okay? And there have been great works of accomplishment, and it's actually, after a while, after a work is more mature, it's going to be a little more similar, just culturally different, to what we do here. Because you've got some of the same, all the initial energy, and it's different, it's new, is lost, and you're trying to, we're trying to get, you keep up that kind of motion, and it's hard to do. Now, I would say we have other issues here in terms of materialism and other things and distractions that get in our way, but that's not, I don't want to make excuses for us. So we just have to understand that in those who have been baptized that are new to the congregation, I just want us to make sure that we are celebrating that like we would somebody that we hear a big number overseas. One person here matters, and we just get it to make sure we keep a perspective is all. So don't think I'm condemning that number, because we have to say, like, it's kind of the same thing in the school. We have to tell them how many students we have, what we've been doing, what we're graduating. Part of the process, okay? And that's true if you're involved in mission work as well. It's where the emphasis is the emphasis is on the work or on results, because Jesus never put it on the results if I read properly, other than for their benefit, if I'm reading properly from Matthew 13 on the parable of the sower. Caleb?
Also to the point about the numbers and the difference between what we see in Acts 2 and what's described here, is in Acts 2 it says 3,000 were baptized, but it doesn't say Peter got 700.
Yeah, that's That's right. Yeah, that's why he's not mentioned, because he only got 4. That's right. That's a good illustration of it. We decided to follow Peter because he got the most. No, I think that's a good analogy of that. It was the work overall, the gospel. The point in Acts 2 is that was the work of the gospel, not just the work of Peter. There were other apostles preaching the same thing. 3,000 was the total. We have Peter's sermon. Why? Because it's the work of the gospel. And that's what Paul's getting to. I may not get to it, but that's what Paul's getting to. Okay, I think John, did you have something?
Would you like to have been there?
Yeah. I'd have all sorts of questions. I would. But it would have been fantastic. But we can read about it. And then we can get busy doing our saying. All right. So he follows that with Stephanus. He says in verse 16, besides, I do not know whether I baptized any other. Now, the verbs matter here. That is different from saying, when he says, I baptized them, that's different than saying, I do not know if any were baptized. You understand the difference? I immersed versus were immersed. He's talking now personally about how many he himself did. Right? And that's important when we get to verse 17. So we make sure we tie in from verse 14 to 17, and actually Kevin's questions allowed us to kind of already get there, which is nice. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of no effect. Before I explain the whole, I want to draw your attention to the phrase, with wisdom of not with wisdom of words. Why is that there? It's significant. All right, so what is he drawing? And he's contrasted. We always want to look at when we're trying to learn and look at the contrasts. And that's because that's how we determine when we have these kind of questions. Christ did not send me. Now that's important. It's interesting because that's the verb form of apostle. Okay, to send on a commission. What is your job? What are you supposed to do? Well, Paul says it wasn't to baptize. Now, let's stop right there. And we're going to go back to Matthew chapter 28, okay, in which the Great Commission that Jesus gave to the apostles, now Paul wasn't there yet, but to the apostles was to go into teach all nations and baptize, right? Now, technically, they were supposed to be go, while going, teach, make disciples, baptizing them. The emphasis, even in that text, is on the instruction. The baptizing comes as a result of the instruction, based upon a decision that the people make. It's not my job to make sure I get people under the water. It's my job to give them the message that tells them they need to do that. And that's what Paul is getting across here. Jesus didn't send him to just be dunking people. I mean, if that were the case, and that's what we're sent to do, then man, maybe I need to up my total, because at camp, in the pool, I've dunked my share. Kids come after you when you're a counselor. You put them under the water. They do it again, you hold them longer. That's the rule. So you get them under the water. That's not the job. That's not what I'm doing. I'm here to preach, he says. Why? Because that's what I can do and be the most effective. It does not take studying at a preaching school to be able to baptize someone. It does not take a ton of knowledge to be able to baptize someone. It takes technique. But I can teach you that in a short amount of time. It takes a long time to teach someone how to preach. Now, they had miraculous gifts, but his point was, this is where the emphasis needs to be, because the power is in the gospel. That's the comparison he's doing throughout this. The power is in the gospel. The gospel message needs to get out there. That's what convicts people's heart. That what makes people change. That is what causes people to want to attach themselves to Jesus Christ who died on the cross for them. That is the message that tells them they need to be baptized. But at that point, there are a number of people here that can handle the actual baptism. And that's what Paul's point is. It's important for us to understand he's getting across, he deliberately is avoiding that personal attachment at the baptism itself. He's deliberately avoiding that because he's prioritizing what he can do that someone else can't. Now, besides other things, that's good leadership principle. But that's what he's doing here with the nature of this. And when you find people that, based upon verse 14 or 17, that want to use this to say, well, see, Paul said that baptism wasn't necessary. That's not what's being said contextually. Verse 13, the assumption was, as I pointed out, he understood they had all been baptized. It's not in verse 13 whether they've been baptized, but into whose name they were baptized that comes up. And the same question is continued in verses 14 through 17. It's not whether they'd been baptized, but he's trying to get them off of this attachment of by whom. And he's wanting them to get off of that attachment and get to the attachment of what the gospel message itself that they heard was about and who it was about. And that's the key to help people see that contextually. And that if baptism were not required, two things. If baptism were not required, Paul would not have to be having this discussion in this way. That's number one. Number two, if Paul was not requiring baptism for remission of sins in his preaching, that he was a hypocrite because that's what he did to become a Christian in Acts 22 and verse 16. Okay? So you need to be aware of that when you find people that want to kind of discount this or use this to somehow take it out of its context and use it saying something it's not intended at all to say. Now, one more thing while we wind this up. The emphasis that Paul has been making has been moving this in the direction of the message. Now, you've been very kind and you're taking my word for that a little bit, but it starts with the idea of into the name of, which he had developed as a theme at the first 10 verses. He was there talking about into the name of, the name of, the name of, being significant before he got to this point. And immediately after this, when he's talking about the preaching priority, and it's about the message and making sure that you are committing to Jesus and the message, he begins talking about, guess what? The gospel. So that what you have here in these verses is the place where these two ideas overlap. That is, it is the gospel that matters because the gospel is the message that takes you to Jesus, ties you to Jesus, and convinces you to begin a relationship with Jesus by being baptized into Jesus. That does not depend upon being baptized by a preacher, because the baptism process itself has nothing to do with the preacher who preached. That is about you. It's passive. You were baptized. You submitting yourself and your will to Christ so that you can have that proper relationship with him as Lord. It's not about submitting yourself to me, because that's not my job. It's not my role. It's not being baptized by Kevin or Eddie or John makes you a more special, blessed Christian. Doesn't work that way. It wouldn't have worked that way if you were baptized by Paul or Peter either. Why? Because our job today is the same to that extent that theirs was. to get the message out there in as compelling a way as we possibly can. To place it in the hands of the people for you to respond to what Jesus has done, to what the Holy Spirit has inspired, and what God has planned, not to me personally. That's why this mattered so much to Paul. Paul understood his role, and you can tell he's a little bit offended at the idea of anybody following him. And when I look around and drive around and I see people promoting themselves to have their church, it offends me. Because none of them have gone to the cross for me. So let's make sure as we come through a passage like this, we have to deal with the misunderstandings about it, the misapplications about it. But let's make sure we get the lesson from it. And let that tie us closer to Christ in all we do. I appreciate your attention. Really appreciate comments and questions. That helps out. Really does. And we will pick up there in verse 18 next week.